So thank you to Andreas for this very nice introduction. He talked about my most recent book. I'm actually going to take a step back and tell you about an earlier book, which was called The Work of the Imagination. And it was very much inspired by the idea that young children have a rich imagination. And the question was what function that serves both children and, more broadly, human beings. So as you can see from my title, I'm going to especially focus on pretend play. And a little bit later on, I'll talk about the extent to which pretend play interventions led by adults might or might not benefit children. And then, just to finish off, I'll circle back a little bit to the theme that Andreas just mentioned, which is how children learn from what other people tell them. Okay, so let's just think about pretending as an activity. And it has some unusual features. First of all, to the best of our knowledge as developmental psychologists and anthropologists, it's a universal capacity, emerges at around 18 months, 2 years of age. It's not something that you need to teach a child. You don't take a 2-year-old and give it a kind of lesson in pretending. 2-year-olds spontaneously engage in that kind of activity. It seems to be unique to our species. There are little hints of brief episodes of pretend play in domesticated chimpanzees, but they're nothing like as complicated, rich, elaborate, and collaborative as the kind of thing that we see in human children. And so that raises some interesting questions, given that this capacity emerges so spontaneously, as to what purpose, what function it serves. And that's a reasonable question, because after all, you might say, well, why would it help children to think about things that are not actual, which are not true, to pretend that there's tea in a teacup or that there's a monster behind the door? Why would Mother Nature create a child who had that capacity? Wouldn't they be much better off, so to speak, not being so imaginative, but being more connected to what is really the case, rather than what might be the case? And indeed, I felt when I was working on this topic that if you look back at some of the classics or classic theories of child development, you didn't get much help with respect to thinking about the function of pretend play and imagination. If anything, those theories implied that it was something of a dead end. It didn't lead the child into new places. It came to a halt. So here are a couple of representatives. I'm caricaturing them a little bit, but I don't think I'm overstating it completely. So you probably recognize these two gentlemen, Freud on the left, Piaget on the right. They're not often put side by side just because, of course, they had very different interests. Psychopathology in the case of Freud, mostly working with adults, cognitive development, typically of ordinary children in the case of Piaget. But they do have some theoretical links. They also were addicted to nicotine, as you can see, if you look very carefully. But beyond that, at a theoretical level, there was a connection between them. So on the left, both of them tended to think of play and imagination and fantasy as not very organized thought, not very coherent. And my own view is much more positive. I think children's play, and I'll try to show you 1 or 2 examples, is actually fairly grounded in reality and is based on an understanding of reality, especially a coherent causal understanding of reality. So that's one contrast. The implication of Freud and Piaget is also that when children play, they retreat away from the real world and set it aside, whereas I would argue that actually children are capable, even from around 3 or 4 years of age, of thinking about the possible and comparing it to reality. So making contrasts or comparisons between what might have happened and what actually did happen, which of course is something we adults spend quite a lot of time doing. And I'm arguing that that comes in relatively early. The other claim, which I've already hinted at, that Freud and Piaget propose, is that, if anything, the fantasy life that dominates young children is something that's due to disappear as they become more objective, more rational. The classic Freudian phrase was that where id was, there ego shall be. So eventually the child becomes more connected to logic and rationality. And if you look at Piaget's early writings, he was actually influenced by Freudian thinking, and a lot of the work he did in Paris as a young man was tracking, in his eyes at least, the decline of fantastical thinking and its replacement by objectivity and logic. So if anything, on this view, the child's early imaginative capacities are suppressed or pushed aside by a closer connection to reality. I think that's deeply wrong. I think that children's imagination remains functional and indeed becomes more powerful as they get older, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Okay. So just to sum up, I'm going to make 3 claims about early imagination. It's grounded in knowledge of reality. It enables comparisons between possibility and reality, and the imagination becomes more elaborate and powerful. So let me start with the first claim, that pretend is grounded in reality. So if you think about pretend play as it's sort of represented in an almost caricature-like fashion, we think of the pretend tea party that a young child will engage in with teapot, cups, and so forth. So I just want to show you a brief clip, and I'll make 1 or 2 remarks about it in a moment. This is actually my wife's great niece, who's kindly allowed me to show a little clip of her. She's aged 2, and she's with her grandfather.
Cora, est-ce que je peux avoir un café, s'il te plaît?
Can I have a coffee, please?
Ah, elle est où la tasse?
Where's the cup?
Voilà.
She's a very sophisticated barista, as you see. She's very particular.
Merci.
And there she just hands the cup to him. So a couple of things to comment on there. First of all, as you could see, she was in part prompted by the language that her grandfather produced. He asked her, could I have a cup of coffee? She then engaged with the coffee-making script. But the other thing I want to point out is that this is very sophisticated, as it were, 21st century pretend. You notice, being Swiss, she has an espresso machine, nothing to do with teapots, nothing so English as a teapot is visible. But my point is that children's imagination is inspired by the everyday world around them, and in the case of a young child in Geneva, it's going to be Nespresso rather than teapot. This particular pattern of borrowing from the activities of the surrounding adults is found in other parts of the world. There's a picture of a social anthropologist called Adam Boyette, who's worked in the Congo Basin, following children and recording what they're doing for several hours at a time. As you can see, he's taking a breather at this point after this activity. What did he find? Well, he was particularly interested in how they spent their day, whether it was involved in work-based activities, and the extent to which play was involved in particular, the extent to which they engaged in pretend play. And the key point I want to emphasize is that, yes, they engage in pretend play, but also, importantly, the majority of their pretend play is indeed a reproduction of the everyday subsistence activities of the community. So to give you some examples, they pretend to fetch water with miniature containers. They cook in inedible leaves, and so forth. So Cora in Geneva is not doing anything radically new, at least in terms of the history of the human species. Young children, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, are watching the adults around them and reproducing those activities. But I want to emphasize that their reproduction is not mechanical or thoughtless. It's driven also by a causal understanding of what you need to do in order for certain things to happen. So now I'm moving to some more experimental work done some years ago with Bob Kavanagh, a colleague at Williams College in Massachusetts. So we tested children who are quite young, as you can see, 21 to 30 months, and they would watch an adult who would pick up a bottle of tomato ketchup, and there was a toy pig on the play table, and the adult would pick up the bottle and, as it were, bring the bottle close to the tail of the pig, as if squeezing tomato ketchup over the pig. And then the child was shown 3 different pictures and asked to choose which picture showed what had happened to the pig, not what had actually happened, because nothing had happened. The container of ketchup was closed, but what had happened in the pretend world, which the adult was inviting the child to conjure up. Well, here's an illustration, so to speak, of this make-believe outcome, but the child was also shown a picture of the pristine pig, so to speak, unblemished by any tomato ketchup, and finally, the pig with an irrelevant change. So the child was shown these 3 pictures I've just shown you, and was asked what happened to the pig. So let's take a look, and I'm going to split the children into younger children under the age of 2. They haven't passed their first birthday and above, so 21 months on average, 27 months on average. And we'll look at the frequency with which they choose those 3 pictures. And as you can see, the younger children are not very good. They're not very systematic. So they're as likely to choose the correct picture, the blue bar, as the other 2. A little bit of a hint of getting it right, but it's not statistically significant. But by the time we move up to the 27-month-olds, systematically choosing that picture of the pig with tomato ketchup on its tail. Now notice that in some ways, of course, this is terribly easy for us adults, but think about the fact that when we say to the child, what's happened to the pig? Can you show me what's happened to the pig? If the child looks at the pig, well, it's got no ketchup on its back. So in some sense, the natural picture to choose would be the pig unblemished rather than the pig with the tomato ketchup. So we're already seeing the fact that in terms of thinking about an episode of pretend play, the child is transporting what they know about the real world into this pretend scenario and knows that, well, when you squeeze ketchup bottles, liquid comes out. Here's another illustration of the same thing, a little bit more complicated now. So this experiment was done with two groups of children. For one group of children, we would pick up a milk carton, pour milk into a little matchbox container, and then we would carry the matchbox container over to a horse, turn it upside down, And of course, the toy horse would then get some milk on its back in the pretend world. The other group of children see the adult pick up a can of talcum powder, shake the talcum powder into the container, again carries the container over, turns it upside down, and the horse is covered in talcum powder. So our question was, are children sophisticated enough to keep track of what happens in these two scenarios and to differentiate the consequences of the one as compared to the other? So when we asked the children, so what's happened to the horse? He's all, you can see the children on the left-hand side said wet, milky, got milk on and so forth. The children on the right-hand side realized that the horse is powdery, got powder on him. Now, this little experiment, simple though it is, I think illustrates an important point about the child's imagination, that just as we would see when the child listens to a narrative, the child can envisage transformation number one, which leads to a certain consequence, which sets the scene for transformation number two, which presupposes the consequence of transformation number one. So in other words, the contents of the first container determine what happens to the horse in the second transformation. And I mean, I'm simplifying enormously, but that's essentially the basis of fiction. And so we're seeing really that these 2-year-olds are already capable of entering into narrativized fiction. Okay, so to make some conclusions then from this brief introduction to pretend play, I want to emphasize that children's pretend play is based on the real world, and that in part their ability to engage with a partner depends upon their understanding of the real world and also their ability to transpose their knowledge about the way that the real world works into the gestures and activities of their play partner, to realize that when the play partner does this, such and such an outcome will take place. So you're also seeing then the child's naive physics is entering into their grasp of pretend play. Okay, so there's brief support for my first claim. Let me now turn to the second claim, this analysis of reality in comparison with what is the child going on in the child's imagination, the comparison between possibility and reality. So to do this, we were working with 3- and 4-year-olds, and we were particularly interested in their ability to grasp conditional permission rules. There is a cognitive psychological background to this, which I won't go into. Suffice it to say that sometimes these conditional rules are tricky even for adults, but particularly when they're couched in terms of obligation, children and adults do reasonably well. So we would tell the child a story about a little boy who wants to do some painting. This is one of several stories, it's just an illustration. And we would say that he went to ask his mother whether he could do some painting, and she told him, yes, you can do some painting if you wear your apron. And then we would show the child several pictures and ask the child to tell us in which picture this little boy was being naughty. So here's one of the pictures. So you can see the boy has got his apron on, but he's actually not doing any painting. So in other words, he's not performing the act, even though he's meeting the condition. Here's a very good little boy. He's got his apron on while he does his painting. Here's another boy. He's not performing the act. He doesn't need to meet the condition. And here's the villain of the piece, so to speak. A boy painting without his apron. So we would lay these 4 pictures out in front of the child, and the child will be asked, so which of the boys is being naughty? And here are the findings, with the 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds systematically choosing that final picture where the boy is performing the act but not meeting the condition. Now, how does this relate to my more broader claim about the relationship between possibility and reality? Well, we asked the children to say, tell me, why is he being naughty? You chose that picture, but what's he doing that's wrong? And we got various kinds of justifications from the children, which fell into these three categories. Some children simply talked about what he was doing. He's doing some painting. Some children reiterated the rule that the boy's mother had voiced, he must put his apron on. But especially interesting were the children who focused on the missing condition. He hasn't put his apron on. And if we look at the graph here, that final emphasis on the missing condition, the yellow bar, as you can see, dominates the 3-year-olds' justifications, but also the 4-year-olds' justifications in particular. Now, those missing condition justifications are intriguing because the child is invoking something that didn't happen. The child is thinking about the possibility that the little boy could have put his apron on. So here we've got a mini illustration of the way in which certain moral judgments turn on a comparison between what somebody's actually done and what they should have done instead. And the child's justifications highlights, as it were, the possibility which is unfulfilled by this naughty boy. I should add that you see certain similarities between these findings with respect to obligation and other findings that we gathered with respect to children's causal analyses. So, for example, we told children a story about a girl who paints with, does some painting, does some drawing with a pen, a blue pen, and she gets ink on her fingers. And when we asked children how come she'd gotten ink on her fingers, again we saw this phenomenon of children thinking about what could have happened instead. So they might say, well, she should have used a pencil, or even more imaginatively, she should have put gloves on. Okay, I could say more, but let me just emphasize then that I've given you a taste of data suggesting that children's imagination is used not to retreat from reality. It is used in that fashion sometimes, but sometimes children, as it were, examine possibility and then go back and compare what could have happened with what actually happened, contrary to the stance taken by Freud and Piaget. Now let's turn to the developmental claim. Since writing the book on children's imagination, which came out in 2000, I've been more and more intrigued by the fact that children do indeed have an imagination, but it's also not as fantastical and powerful as some researchers and educators would argue. There's a certain sense in which, to put it bluntly, children's imagination is a bit dull. It's a bit plodding. And let me highlight that point by showing you a movie. Now, this is a crow from New Caledonia. I was very intrigued recently because the people of New Caledonia voted whether to leave France or to continue to be under the jurisdiction of France. They decided to stick with France. We'll see how that works out. Anyway, so these crows are unusually smart. And let me show you what happens. So there's a basket in the bottom with a handle, and she's trying to get it out. She's holding a piece of wire, which is straight, and she's poking away at the basket in the bottom, not very successfully. She's called Betty, by the way. So she gives up for the moment. She's still carrying the wire. In a moment, she's going to try again. So, as you saw, she pressed the wire against this container, managed to bend it, and then she puts the wire back inside the tube and therefore manages to hook it underneath the handle. So I hope you appreciate my little joke, bend it like Betty, for those of you who saw that wonderful movie, Bend It Like Beckham. Anyway. Now, so here's a crow being impressively innovative and imaginative. I may say that when the experimenters doing this study didn't set it up for Betty to do this, what had happened was that she had offered to her 2 wires. One was bent and one was straight, but her predecessor, another crow, had stolen the hook, and so Betty was left to her own devices, so to speak. The experimenters didn't expect her to be able to manufacture a hook, but this is what she did. Okay, this is a nice setup because, of course, it's possible to give young children a similar problem, and we can see how they perform in comparison with a crow. So this was a study done recently by Sarah Beck. I'm happy to say a former student of mine, Sarah. She gives the children the same kind of apparatus as Betty was presented with. In other words, a tube, a basket. In the basket is a sticker which the child would like, and the question is, can the child retrieve the basket with the sticker, even though they can't put their hand in the tube? Now, if the children were given a choice between a straight and a hooked pipe cleaner, most of the children chose the hooked pipe cleaner. So they're fine if the tools are presented to them ready-made. They choose the right tool. They choose the hook rather than the straight pipe cleaner. On the other hand, if they're given the straight pipe cleaner and left to their own devices, and a piece of string, alternatively, and encouraged to use those materials however they would like to retrieve the sticker, they are pretty hopeless. At least the younger ones are pretty hopeless. So almost none of the 3 to 5-year-olds succeed, and even if we turn to 5 and 7-year-olds, fewer than half succeed. So here are the findings. So as you can see, less than 10% at these younger ages are managing to do that simple problem of simply bending the pipe cleaner. As the children get older, more and more manage to do that, and these grey bars indicate children who are using somewhat different solutions. So in some ways, then, we're seeing the limitations of children's imagination here in comparison to a crow. Now, you could say, well, these are Western children. Maybe if we went to a less privileged community where children perhaps had to create their own toys, we might see a better performance. And this was the question that Mark Nielsen and his colleagues asked. So they tested Bushman children in South Africa. And these Bushman children indeed lack prefabricated toys, so they are dependent on their own, so to speak, creativity in manufacturing toys. Here's a child trying to solve the same problem as you just saw with the Sarah Beck study. And so the question was, would these children living in these impoverished circumstances be more innovative than middle-class children living in Australia, which is where Nielsen is based? The evidence was very clear, no difference between these groups of children. So when the children watched the demonstrator bend the pipe cleaner to make a hook, the vast majority could successfully copy that model, but again, if they were left to their own devices, very few of them succeeded. And as I just mentioned, the two groups were comparable in this respect. Okay, so summarizing, young children are extremely good copiers, and when they see someone solve a problem by creating a simple tool, they can do the same. But if they're not given a demonstration, they're not very innovative themselves. And that's true irrespective of their cultural environment. So here we're seeing then, I think, intriguing evidence of the claim that I want to advance, which is that the child's imagination becomes more sophisticated and flexible as the child gets older. The vast majority of these 3-, 4-, 5-year-olds couldn't solve this simple problem. Here's another illustration of the same point. So some years ago, the British psychologist Annette Carmeloff-Smith asked children to draw a man that doesn't exist. This was an intriguing study because a great deal of work in children's drawing was preoccupied with whether children could represent three-dimensionality on the two-dimensional surface. So it was essentially exploring children's figurative abilities. Annette broke away from that by asking children to use their imagination, so to speak, to draw something, in particular, a man that doesn't exist. Well, some children managed to do this by inserting new elements, for example, an extra head. Here's an example. Some managed to do it by shifting around the elements, such as arms and legs. Here's an example. And some managed to do it by importing elements from another category, so they made a kind of hybrid or blend. And here's this centaur-like figure. However, when Annette looked at her data, it was very clear that there was a huge age change in this task. So the younger children had trouble with these creative moves, and you can see that if we're looking at the blue bars, which are 4- to 6-year-olds, very few of them are managing either an insertion or a transposition or an importation, whereas approximately 50%, sometimes more, of the 8- to 10-year-olds are managing those maneuvers to create this impossible man. In a recent study, Marjorie Taylor, who's long studied children's imagination, especially their imaginary companions, has picked this up and looked at individual differences in the imagination. And most recently, she's been studying a very interesting group of children who don't create an imaginary companion, but a whole civilization, a kind of community to which, or within which, they imagine various rules and educational systems and transportation systems. And she's discovering that this tendency among children is more common than we might expect. And she's interviewed children who engage in this kind of activity, sometimes not alone, but in collaboration with other children. So they create these so-called paracosms. And what she did was to give the non-existent person task, and she looked at the extent to which children who don't have a paracosm and children who do have a paracosm succeed in creating, as it were, a non-existent person. So I'm going to show you two pictures, first from a child who doesn't have a paracosm. So here's a real person, rather realistic. This is a child who doesn't have a paracosm. And this child manages to create a somewhat special person, we could say, although strictly speaking, I've occasionally seen women dressed like that. Now let's turn to the child who does have a paracosm. So here's the drawing of a real person by the child who has a paracosm, and here's the drawing of a non-existent person by the child with a paracosm. Okay, so we can see that not only is there a developmental trend, but there seem to be individual differences among children in the power of their imagination. And I think it's reasonable to suppose then that children's imagination, simply a very straightforward developmental claim, children's imagination becomes richer precisely because they can, to some extent, overcome the place that they started with which was their understanding and knowledge of reality. They can tinker with reality and reform it. Okay, so here's a quick summary of my three claims. Now I'm going to turn to talk a little bit about the extent to which pretend play is something that has consequences down the road for children's cognitive development. I do this with some hesitation, partly because I'm not sure whether we should worry about this too much. But within the world of education, especially preschool education, it has become an issue, particularly in the United States, where encroachments on playtime are increasingly noticeable in preschools and kindergartens. And there's a kind of counter movement trying to show that pretend play is educationally important and not just fun. So in that sense, it pertains to the theme of this meeting. So here's before I go there, let me just say one or two other things. So there was recently a very good review by Angeline Lillard and her students, which reviewed many studies of pretend play and its alleged benefits. And Angeline came to the conclusion that the evidence for the benefits is very, very weak, partly because the studies themselves are not well designed. So, for example, you couldn't really tell whether the intervention was effective, or if it was effective, rather, you didn't know which part of the intervention. Was it just that there were more teachers available? Was it because the children were getting more individual attention? Or was it something to do precisely with the pretend play component of the intervention? Another problem, very often the benefits were alleged by the people who had conducted the intervention. So they were observing the children during the intervention and after the intervention, and they had an investment, presumably, in seeing certain benefits. In the wake of this article, as I say, a careful and thorough critique, if you like, of a lot of work on pretend play, there's one or two more recent studies which are more carefully designed, and I'll just tell you about a couple of them. So one has been done by Goldstein and Lerner. Goldstein is particularly interested in play, dramatic play, role play, and more generally in the theatre. And she compared three groups of children. These are 4- and 5-year-olds. One group were engaged in socio-dramatic play. Another group given the parallel activities, but not involving play. They just engaged in construction play. And a third group listened to stories. Before the intervention started, the children were given a variety of social, cognitive, socio-emotional tasks, and they were again tested at the end. And so the design is a classic one. To what extent does the target intervention group, the children who are getting socio-dramatic play, show some improvement greater than the two control groups? What did she find? Well, there were no differences among the three groups for most of the pre-tests and most of the post-tests. So, in other words, the intervention didn't have any effect, irrespective of the type of intervention, on most measures. Having said that, there were some intriguing hints of one effect, as indexed by two different measures. If anything, the children in the socio-dramatic play group were better at watching and coping with seeing somebody in distress, less likely to show disturbance than themselves. And the authors speculate then that these dramatic illustrations, which they would have engaged in during the socio-dramatic play intervention, in some sense help children better regulate their own emotions vis-a-vis somebody expressing distress. So there's one well-designed study showing an emotional benefit. Here's a second example, rather similar design, 3- to 5-year-olds. Three groups again, one engaged in fantastical pretend play, a second various non-pretend activities such as colouring, ball games and so forth, and a third group, business as usual. Again, children tested before the interventions start, children tested after the interventions, and what they found was that on executive function measures, which have become rather a big deal in the United States, by executive function, educators really mean the ability to concentrate on a task, to not be distracted, but if and when appropriate, to shift attention to some new rule or new guidelines. No effect of the intervention on several measures of so-called executive function. On the other hand, there was an effect on one aspect of the test battery. Children in the fantastical pretend play group did a little bit better on a test of working memory. And that was especially clear, as it happened, among those children within the pretend play group who themselves were especially prone to engage in more fantastical pretend play, showing, in my terms then, a somewhat more powerful imagination. So I've given you just a brief taste of ongoing work on the alleged benefits of pretend play. There are some modest benefits to be observed. At the same time, I think it's important to stress that more research is needed to pinpoint exactly why these interventions are helpful, and also to keep in mind that there may be neglected benefits that haven't been explored, but also to keep in mind that there may be no benefits in certain domains. And then the question is, well, can we defend devoting a lot of time to play? I would say we certainly can, but that's another more policy-oriented discussion. Let me just end by coming back to the line of research that Andreas mentioned. So a couple of concluding thoughts on the role of testimony. So I use the word testimony to mean when the child is given verbal information by an adult which helps the child to conceptualize the world. So I'm going to give you two simple illustrations of this work. And just to give you a brief idea of how I got to this, at the end of the book on the imagination, I started to think about the links between children's imagination and children's language. And by the age of 2.5, 3, children are already engaging in conversations about things that are not here and not present in the room. They're talking about something that happened yesterday, or they're hearing a story about a fictional character. And so already children's imagination and children's language are glued together, so to speak, in the sense that the child uses their imagination to think about things that are not visible, not observable. And that can apply to things that will never be observable. I mean, if you tell the child of 3 or 4 about a dinosaur, chances are the child is never going to see a dinosaur. You could tell the child about a germ, or you could tell the child about God, or the afterlife, or creation, or the Civil War, a whole panoply of events and activities and entities the child can absorb by this conjunction of imagination and talk from adults. The other thing that children can do, I think, is to do mini thought experiments with the guidance of an adult. So let me just describe this mini thought experiment. So here's an apparatus in which you can put a ball in one of the upper cups. And if you put it in the upper cup, it'll of course travel down the tube and end up in one of the red cups below. If you give 2- and 3-year-olds this task and you ask them, if I put it in the left-hand cup, where will it end up? They systematically make a mistake. Maybe you can guess what they do. They say it's going to be in that left-hand red cup. 2- and 3-year-olds know quite a lot about gravity, and they think that gravity is going to rule the day in this environment. It's going to deliver that ball straight down into the cup underneath. So we wondered whether we could provide testimony and prompt the child's imagination in order to get over this problem. Let me just show you, first of all, 3 groups that we tested in a pretest, and you can see that the blue bars indicate that the majority of responses are aimed at this so-called gravity cup. We then gave children 3 types of advice. So one group were told, you know, the ball can't escape from the tube, it rolls inside the tube. Another group were told, what you need to do is watch which tube the ball goes in, and then you need to follow with your eyes. And finally, the attention group was told you have to pay attention to the tubes to find the ball quickly. Now, our idea was that the first 2 groups invite the child to start thinking in detail about this ball that goes inside the cup and then what happens to it, to visualize it traveling constrained by the tube. And that was, in fact, what we found with the children doing much better in the no escape and eye movement group and not showing any improvement in the attention group. Why is this important? Well, think back to the history of science, going back as far as Galileo. Thought experiments have been very important in science. We use our imagination, we envisage what might have happened or what will happen, and these change our conceptions. And this little experiment, I think, shows that even 3- and 4-year-olds are capable of doing thought experiments. But if you read most texts in education, they will tell you children learn by hands-on experience and observation. And I'm saying, hold on a second, they might also learn by your inviting them to think, to use their imagination. Finally, as I said a moment ago, children can learn a great deal about about reality, not just about fictional worlds or fantastical worlds, by listening to what other people tell them, whether it's about the past, whether it's about scientific phenomena, or whether it's about religious and spiritual phenomena. And I'm going to stop there.